The hall had been designed by a species that clearly did not believe in moderation. Tevin noticed this immediately, mostly because he had been trying very hard not to notice anything at all. The ceiling stretched so high that it seemed less like architecture and more like a polite suggestion to the stars outside. Light filtered down in slow, shifting layers, as if it had to think carefully about how to behave in a place like this. Every surface carried a faint hum, not loud enough to be heard, but present enough to be felt in the bones. Tevin had the distinct impression that if he stood still long enough, the building itself might politely inquire about his intentions. He had chosen his seat with care. Not too close to the Queen, not too far from relevance, a position of strategic invisibility. Years of diplomatic service had taught him that the safest place to be in any alien court was somewhere between technically important and easily forgotten. He had achieved that balance perfectly. No one had looked at him twice. This, of course, was when everything went wrong. He was halfway through examining something on his plate that appeared to be both liquid and geometrically stable when the subtle shift in the room reached him. Conversations did not stop exactly, but they adjusted. Like a school of fish sensing a larger presence. Tevin did not look up immediately. That would have been a mistake. Instead, he waited the precise amount of time required to pretend he had only just noticed something was happening. By the time he raised his eyes, Queen Sarah was already moving. She did not walk so much as arrive in places. One moment she was at the far end of the hall, surrounded by officials and light, and the next she was near enough that Tevin could see the delicate metallic threads woven through her hair, each one catching the ambient glow and bending it into soft, shifting colors. Her long ears angled slightly forward, attentive, curious, like she had just remembered something mildly interesting. Tevin considered several options in rapid succession. None of them involved being addressed directly. "Ambassador Tevin," she said, and there it was, the collapse of his entire strategy. He stood because not standing would have been worse, and inclined his head with what he hoped was the correct balance of respect and not panicking. "Your Majesty." She studied him for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to be uncomfortable and not nearly long enough to be rude. Up close, her presence was precise, not intimidating in the traditional sense, but inevitable, like gravity deciding to take a personal interest in you. "I hope the arrangements are satisfactory," she said. "They are exceptional," Tevin replied, which was true in the sense that he had never before been concerned that his meal might achieve sentience. "Good," she said, and then, without warning or ceremony, she stepped closer. Not much, just enough. Tevin felt the shift before he understood it. The rest of the hall faded, not visually, not entirely, but in importance. The Queen leaned in slightly, her voice lowering, not to a whisper, but to something more deliberate, something meant only for him. "My widowed sister," she said, as if discussing weather patterns, "wishes to marry you." Tevin's mind did something unusual at that point. It stopped. Not entirely. That would have been inconvenient. But the part of it responsible for processing reality took a brief, necessary break. In its absence, several less useful thoughts attempted to take control. This is a misunderstanding. This is a translation error. This is a very elaborate joke. He managed, through long practice and a certain amount of desperation, to keep his face neutral. There was a pause, a small one, possibly noticeable only to those who ruled entire systems. "I see," he said, which was a remarkable achievement, considering he did not. "Do you?" the Queen asked. And there was something in her tone now, not quite amusement, not quite curiosity, something sharper, more interested. Tevin considered saying no. It was, objectively, the most accurate answer available to him. He did not in fact see anything about this situation that made sense. Instead he said, "I believe I may require additional context." "Of course," she said, with the calm satisfaction of someone who had no intention of providing it immediately. She straightened, the moment folding back into the larger shape of the evening as if it had never existed. Conversations resumed their previous patterns. Light continued its slow descent from the impossible ceiling. Somewhere someone laughed at something that was probably not a marriage proposal. "Enjoy the evening, Ambassador," she added, and then she was gone. Just like that. Teban remained standing for a fraction longer than necessary, then sat down with great care, as if sudden movements might cause reality to notice him again. He looked at his plate. The geometrically stable liquid had not changed. This felt unfair. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his gaze. Across the hall, seated in composed stillness, was a woman he had never met and immediately recognized. Empress Widow Rael. She did not move. She did not acknowledge him. Her posture was flawless, her expression controlled, her presence undeniable. Everything about her suggested certainty, authority, a life lived at the center of decisions that reshaped entire systems. And yet, at that exact moment, her eyes shifted, just slightly. They met his. For a single, precise instant, Teban saw something that did not belong in any official report. Not confidence, not calculation. Something closer to, oh no. It was gone immediately, replaced by perfect composure, as if it had never been there. But Teban had seen it. And worse, he understood it. She had just heard the same thing. Teban exhaled slowly, the sound lost in the vastness of the hall. He reached for his drink, paused, then set it back down. No, he thought. He would need a clearer mind for this. Then after a brief reconsideration, he picked it up again. On second thought, perhaps not that clear. Teban decided with great determination and very little confidence that the most reasonable course of action was to behave as though nothing unusual had happened. This was a strategy he had relied on for years, and it had served him well, primarily because most situations did not involve being casually informed of a potential marriage to one of the most powerful figures in the inner systems. He adjusted his posture, picked up a utensil whose purpose he did not entirely understand, and nodded politely as the official beside him resumed explaining the delicate fermentation process of asteroid-grown fruit. Apparently, the gravity fluctuations improved the flavor. Teban found this deeply fascinating for approximately 3 seconds. Across the hall, Rael did not look at him again. This was both a relief and a problem. He found himself tracking her without meaning to, noticing the subtle precision of her movements, the way others gave her space without being asked, the quiet deference that followed her like a shadow. Her long ears were angled slightly backward now, not in hostility, but in focus, as if she were listening to something far more important than the conversation in front of her. Possibly her own thoughts. Teban understood that feeling. And of course, the mineral density varies depending on orbital decay, the official was saying, gesturing enthusiastically with something that might have been a fork, which is why the third pressing is considered extraordinarily complex, Teban said, with the confidence of someone who had not heard a single word after asteroid vineyard. The official beamed. Exactly. Teban nodded, pleased with himself for surviving that exchange, and reached for his drink again. This time, he committed. The liquid was cool, faintly luminous, and tasted like something that had once been alive and was now reconsidering its life choices. He swallowed carefully. There were advantages to focusing on small things. It prevented larger thoughts from organizing themselves into something dangerous, like a plan. Unfortunately, his mind did not respect this boundary. Why me? The question arrived uninvited and refused to leave. He was not remarkable. This was not false modesty. It was a professionally cultivated fact. He was competent, observant, and exceedingly good at not being the center of attention. None of these qualities suggested that an empress, widowed, powerful, and, if the briefings were to be believed, not inclined toward unnecessary attachments, would select him for anything, let alone marriage. Unless, of course, she hadn't. Teban glanced just briefly in her direction again. Rael was speaking now, her voice too soft to carry across the distance, her expression composed. The individual she addressed nodded with the careful attentiveness of someone aware that missing a detail might have consequences extending beyond their immediate career. Everything about her suggested control, except for that one moment. Teban leaned back slightly, considering. There was a possibility, small but persistent, that this situation was not entirely of her making. The Queen had delivered the information with a certain personal interest, Not manipulation exactly, something more refined, as if she had arranged a meeting between two ideas and was now waiting to see what would happen. Teven did not appreciate being treated as an idea. He took another sip of his drink. On the other hand, he appreciated it more than being treated as a political liability, which had been the theme of his previous posting. The dinner continued, a slow procession of courses and conversations that flowed around him like a carefully managed current. At some point, a device the size of his palm drifted past his shoulder, projecting a faint field that translated overlapping languages into something comprehensible. Teven caught fragments of discussion, trade routes, defensive alignments, a brief and surprisingly heated debate about the ethical implications of predictive weather control. He focused on breathing, on sitting, on not accidentally agreeing to anything else. Time passed, or something resembling it. Eventually, the structure of the evening began to loosen. Conversations shifted from formal to something more fluid. Individuals stood, moved, reconfigured themselves into smaller clusters. The vastness of the hall became less oppressive, more navigable. Teven recognized this phase. It was the dangerous one. This was where unexpected interactions occurred. He waited, giving the illusion of patience, while internally calculating the least noticeable path toward an exit. There were several options. None of them guaranteed success. One of them involved a corridor he was reasonably certain led to a storage area, which was not ideal but had its merits. He stood. No one stopped him. Encouraging. He moved with measured calm, neither too fast nor too slow, adjusting his direction as needed to avoid direct lines of sight. Years of practice guided him, a subtle art of presence and absence. He was almost there. The edge of the hall approached, the ambient hum shifting as he neared the transition into the quieter corridors beyond. Freedom, or at least a convincing imitation of it, was within reach. "Ambassador," Teven stopped. Of course he did. He turned because not turning would have been worse, and found himself facing Empress Widow Rael at a distance that suggested this had not been an accident. Up close, the details were sharper. The precision of her features, the faint, shifting tones along her skin that caught the light differently as she moved. The subtle tension held just beneath her composure. Her long ears angled slightly forward now, attentive in a way that felt focused. There was no one else nearby. Naturally. "I believe," or she said, her voice calm, measured, "we have been given the same information." Teven considered several responses. None of them seemed appropriate. "Yes," he said finally, "it appears we have." There was a pause, not empty, not uncomfortable, just present. "I was not consulted," she said. Teven blinked, not visibly. He had standards. "That is," she continued with the faintest narrowing of her eyes, "unusual." Teven felt something settle into place. "Yes," he said, more carefully this time, "I had reached a similar conclusion." For a moment, nothing happened. Then unexpectedly, Rael exhaled. It was a small thing, subtle, but it changed the space between them, just enough. "I assume," she said, "that you do not have a prepared response to this situation?" Teven almost smiled. "I regret to inform you," he replied, "that I do not even have an unprepared one." There it was, a flicker, brief but unmistakable. The corner of her mouth shifted, just slightly, as if she had not intended to react at all, and was now reconsidering that decision. "Good," she said. Teven tilted his head. "Good?" "Yes," she said, her composure returning, though not entirely unchanged. "It would be concerning if you did." He considered that. "That is reassuring," he said. "I was beginning to worry I was underprepared." "You are," she said. "I assumed as much." Another pause. Different this time. Less like a trap, more like an opening. Teven glanced briefly toward the hall behind them, then back to her. "Would you," he said with careful neutrality, "prefer to discuss this somewhere that does not echo quite so dramatically?" Rael followed his gaze, considering the vast space, the distant conversations, the ever-present hum. "Yes," she said, "I believe I would." They stood there for a moment longer, two individuals caught in the precise center of something neither of them had chosen, and then, without further ceremony, They turned and walked into the corridor together. Tevin resisted the urge to look back. He had a feeling the hall was watching. The corridor did not simply extend away from the hall, it seemed to withdraw from it, as if the palace itself preferred quieter thoughts once one step beyond the reach of ceremony. The hum softened here, becoming something closer to a pulse than a presence, and the light shifted into a steadier tone, no longer competing for attention. Tevin noticed immediately that it was easier to think. This, he suspected, might be dangerous. They walked side by side without speaking at first, not out of discomfort, but out of a shared understanding that whatever conversation was about to happen would require a certain amount of space to exist properly. Their footsteps made almost no sound. Tevin briefly wondered if the floor was compensating for them, which felt both impressive and mildly intrusive. Rael was the first to slow. Not stop. She did not seem like someone who stopped unless it was intentional, but slowed just enough that the corridor widened around them into a space that might generously be described as private. The walls here curved inward slightly, embedded with faintly glowing structures that resembled veins of light, shifting in subtle patterns that suggested some deeper function. Tevin resisted the urge to ask if they were alive. "I assume," Rael said, her voice quieter now, though no less precise, "that you are attempting to understand the situation." "I am attempting several things," Tevin replied. "Understanding is one of them. Escaping was another, briefly, but that seems less viable at the moment." Rael glanced at him, not sharply, not with judgment, just a glance. "Escaping," she repeated. "Only in theory," Tevin said quickly. "I have not yet committed to the concept." There was a pause. "I see," she said in a way that suggested she did not entirely believe him, but was willing to allow the statement to exist. Tevin inclined his head slightly. It felt like the correct response to being gently disbelieved by an empress. They stood in the quiet for a moment longer, the faint light along the walls shifting in patterns that Tevin was beginning to suspect were responsive to something. Movement, perhaps, or proximity. One section brightened slightly as Rael adjusted her stance, her long ear angling toward the corridor behind them before settling again. "You said," she continued, "that you did not have a response." "That is correct. And yet you have remained." Tevin considered that. "Yes," he said, "that part is less about decision and more about circumstance." "Explain." He exhaled slowly, choosing his words with care. "If I leave abruptly," he said, "it becomes a statement. If I stay, it remains a situation. I have found that situations are easier to survive than statements." Rael studied him, not superficially, not as one might assess a political asset or a potential liability. There was a depth to her attention now, a quiet evaluation that felt different. "That is a very human approach," she said. Tevin tilted his head slightly. "Is that a compliment?" "I have not decided," she replied. "That seems consistent," he said. There it was again, that almost smile. Fleeting, controlled, but present. Tevin felt an unexpected sense of achievement, as if he had successfully navigated a conversation without triggering a diplomatic incident or accidentally agreeing to marry someone else. Progress. "I was also not consulted," Rael said after a moment, her tone returning to something more measured. "This is unusual." Tevin nodded. "So you mentioned." "In my position," she continued, "decisions of this nature are not made without my direct involvement. I can see how that would be preferable." "Yes." Another pause. Different again. Less tense. More reflective. Tevin found himself watching her more closely now, noticing the subtle shifts in her posture, the way her composure was not a static state, but an active one, maintained with precision. There was something beneath it, not weakness, not uncertainty, something more complex. "You disagree," she said suddenly. Tevin blinked. What?" "You disagree with something," she said, her gaze steady. "You have not spoken it." Tevin opened his mouth, then closed it again. This was, he realized, the problem with speaking to someone who was accustomed to being listened to very carefully. "I am considering the possibility," he said slowly, "that this may not be entirely about you." The words hung in the air. Rael did not react immediately. Her expression remained composed, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the angle of her ears, a slight adjustment that suggested attention had sharpened. "Continue," she said. Teban took a breath. "The Queen," he said, choosing each word with deliberate care, "does not seem like someone who acts without purpose." "That is correct. And yet," he continued, "this decision appears unstructured, at least on the surface." Rael's gaze did not waver. "You believe there is another intention?" "I believe," Teban said, "that if there is not, then this is the most elaborate misunderstanding I have ever been involved in, and I have been involved in several." There was a beat of silence. Then unexpectedly, Rael let out a quiet breath that might, under different circumstances, have been a laugh. "Several," she repeated. Teban nodded solemnly. "I have documentation." "I would expect nothing less." They stood there, the tension between them shifting once more. No longer sharp or uncertain, but something more balanced. Not resolved, not by any measure, but shared. Rael turned slightly, her gaze moving down the corridor as if considering paths that extended beyond it. "If this is intentional," she said, "then it is a test." "Of what?" Teban asked. She looked back at him. "That," she said, "is what concerns me." Teban followed her gaze for a moment, then returned it to her. "I should warn you," he said after a brief pause, "that I do not perform particularly well under tests I am not aware of." Rael regarded him. "That may be an advantage," she said. Teban considered that. "I will choose to believe you," he said. A faint shift of her expression suggested that, for the first time, she might actually mean what she was saying. The corridor remained quiet around them, the soft pulse of the walls steady, almost patient. Somewhere far beyond the palace, entire systems moved in careful alignment, decisions unfolding across distances that defied immediate understanding. Here, in this narrow space between intention and consequence, two individuals stood at the beginning of something neither of them had chosen, and neither of them, Teban realized, was in a hurry to leave. The corridor did not end so much as it reconsidered its purpose. At some point, the walls widened, the light softened, and the architecture shifted from something designed to impress into something designed to observe. Teban noticed the transition a moment too late, which was how he found himself stepping into a chamber that felt less like a passage and more like a decision. He stopped. Not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that something had changed. Rael did not stop immediately. She took 2 more steps, then turned slightly, her long ear angling back toward him in a subtle question. "This," Teban said carefully, "feels intentional." Rael glanced around the chamber. The walls were no longer smooth. They were layered, almost organic, threaded with faint lines of light that pulsed in slow, deliberate patterns. At the center of the space stood a low structure, perhaps a table, perhaps something else entirely, its surface shifting faintly, like it was deciding what it wanted to be. "Yes," she said, "it does." Teban resisted the urge to walk backward out of the room. "I would like to clarify," he added, "that I did not choose this location." "Nor did I," Rael replied. They stood there for a moment, both of them evaluating the space with the same quiet suspicion one might reserve for a conversation that had already started without them. Then the room reacted. It was subtle at first. The light along the walls adjusted, narrowing slightly, focusing inward. The central structure shifted, its surface stabilizing into something more recognizable. A table, now clearly a table, with 2 distinct sides. Teban closed his eyes briefly. "Of course," he murmured. Rael's gaze moved from the table to him. "You expected this?" "I expected something," he said. "I was hoping it would be less furnished." The table emitted a soft tone, not quite a sound, more like a polite acknowledgement. Teban looked at it. "I do not like that it heard me," he said. "It is a responsive system," Rael replied. "It reacts to presence, to voice, to—" "Yes," Teban said quickly. "I understood that part. I am choosing not to engage with it emotionally." Rael studied him for a fraction longer than necessary. "That may not be possible." "That is deeply unfortunate." The table shifted again, its surface smoothing into a translucent plane, Lines of light formed across it, intersecting, aligning, until they resolved into something structured. Symbols. Data. A language Tevan did not recognize immediately, but one his translator implant began to interpret with a faint delay. He leaned forward slightly, then immediately regretted it. "This is," he said slowly, "a proposal interface." Rael did not move. "Yes," she said. Tevan stared at the table. "Of course it is." The symbols adjusted, responding to their proximity. Information expanded, layers unfolding into readable segments. Tevan caught fragments, names, titles, systems, agreements. His own name appeared briefly, then shifted as if acknowledging his attention. He straightened. "I would like to formally state," he said, "that I have not agreed to anything." The table dimmed slightly. Rael's gaze flickered toward it, then back to him. "It is not recording consent," she said. "That is reassuring," Tevan replied. "I would prefer not to accidentally confirm a marriage while adjusting my posture." There was a pause, then, unexpectedly, Rael exhaled through her nose in a way that was unmistakably amusement. Tevan glanced at her. "I am pleased," and he said, "that this situation has reached a point where it can be considered mildly entertaining." "It has not," she said. "But we are approaching it," he insisted. Her expression shifted, just slightly. "Perhaps." The table pulsed again, drawing their attention back. New information surfaced, this time more direct. A sequence of conditions, not demands exactly. Parameters. Tevan read in silence for a moment. "This is not a simple union," he said finally. "No," Rael replied. "It is not." He looked at her. "It is a consolidation." "Yes." "Of territories." "Yes." "Of influence." "Yes." Tevan nodded slowly. "And we," he said, gesturing lightly between them, "are apparently the symbolic representation of that consolidation." Rael's gaze did not waver. "That is one interpretation." Tevan considered that. "I am struggling to find a more comforting one." The table shifted again, as if responding to the tone of the conversation. The data reorganized, highlighting a different set of parameters. Personal ones. Tevan leaned in despite himself. "This," he said, "is new." Rael stepped closer, her attention sharpening. The information was different, less formal, less structured. It did not list territories or agreements. It listed variables, compatibility metrics, behavioral projections, psychological alignments. Tevan blinked. "This is evaluating us," he said. "Yes," Rael replied. "In real time." "Yes." Tevan looked at the table. "I would like to clarify," he said, "that I did not consent to being evaluated." The table emitted another soft tone. Rael's ear flicked slightly. "It is not asking," she said. Tevan nodded. "I had that impression." They stood there side by side now, the distance between them reduced without either of them consciously deciding to close it. The table continued its quiet assessment, patterns shifting, data aligning into something that felt increasingly personal. Tevan glanced at her. "I assume," he said carefully, "that this is where we are expected to respond." Rael did not answer immediately. Her gaze remained on the table, on the shifting patterns, on the quiet, persistent logic of the system. "Yes," she said finally. Tevan exhaled. "I was hoping for a less direct expectation." Rael turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. "That would be easier," she said. "Yes." A pause. Then almost at the same time, they both looked back at the table. The light pulsed once, steady and patient, waiting. Tevan folded his hands behind his back. "Well," he said with quiet resignation, "this is happening." Rael's expression remained composed. "Yes," she said. The table pulsed again, this time with a steadier rhythm, as if it had concluded that waiting politely was no longer efficient. The patterns across its surface reorganized, narrowing into two distinct fields that aligned precisely with where Tevan and Rael stood. The implication was not subtle. Tevan stared at it. "I feel," and he said slowly, "that we are being assigned positions." "We are," Rael replied. "Yes. I had hoped that was metaphorical." "It is not." Tevan shifted his weight slightly, Then, with the cautious reluctance of someone approaching a device that might legally bind him to something unfortunate, stepped closer to the indicated space. The surface brightened beneath him in response, the light adjusting as though acknowledging his cooperation. "I would like to note," he said, "that I am participating under observation." "You are always under observation," Rail said. "Yes," he admitted, "but I prefer when it is less interactive." Rail stepped into her own position with considerably less hesitation. The light beneath her stabilized instantly, sharper, more defined, as if the system recognized something familiar in her presence. Teven noticed that. "That seems unfair," he said. "It is not unfair," she replied. "It is expected." "I was not informed of the expectations," he said. "That is also expected." Teven considered that, then nodded once. "Yes," he said, "that is consistent." The table responded immediately. The surface shifted from passive display into something more active, the patterns tightening into lines that moved between them, forming connections, intersections, possibilities. Symbols translated themselves across Tevin's field of vision, his implant working quickly now, struggling to keep pace with the system's complexity. Compatibility index, behavioral alignment, adaptive variance. Teven exhaled. "These are very large words for something I did not agree to," he said. The table emitted a soft tone, as if mildly offended. Rail's gaze remained fixed on the data. "It is not asking for agreement," she said. "It is measuring response." "That is worse." "Yes." Tevin leaned slightly forward, squinting at a sequence that had begun to pulse more insistently than the others. "What," he said, "is adaptive variance?" Rail followed his gaze. "It is a measure," she said, "of how well two individuals adjust to unexpected conditions when placed in proximity." Teven blinked. "So," he said carefully, "this entire situation." "Yes, I see." He straightened. "That seems unnecessarily specific." The lines between them shifted again, brightening, then dimming, as if recalibrating. A new layer of data surfaced, this one more direct. Not abstract metrics, but scenarios, projections. Teven watched as one unfolded. Two figures, representations, simplified but unmistakable, stood in a space not unlike the corridor they had just left. Variables adjusted around them. Environmental changes, external pressures. The figures responded, their movements altering the outcome. Teven frowned. "It is simulating us," he said. "Yes. In situations we have not agreed to experience." "Yes." Teven nodded slowly. "I would like to formally object." The simulation did not pause. Rail's ear angled slightly toward him. "It will not respond to objections." "I suspected that," he said. "I felt it was important to express it anyway." Another scenario unfolded. This one involved negotiation. A table different from the one they stood at, surrounded by figures that shifted in and out of clarity. The projection of Teven spoke. The projection of Rail responded. The outcome adjusted. Teven watched himself say something he had not yet thought of. "That is concerning," he said. Rail glanced at him. "It is predictive modeling." "Yes," he said. "I prefer to make my own mistakes." The corner of her mouth shifted just slightly. "That may still be possible." "I will hold on to that hope." The table pulsed again, drawing their attention to a different section. The metrics had changed. Some had increased. Others had stabilized. One in particular had shifted enough to be noticeable. Teven pointed at it. "That one," he said. "It moved." Rail followed his gesture. "Behavioral alignment," she said. Teven considered that. "We have been in the same room for less than an hour." "Yes, that seems fast." "Yes." He nodded. "I am not sure how I feel about that." Rail's gaze remained on the table. "It is not measuring comfort," she said. "It is measuring adaptation." Teven exhaled. "Of course it is." The lines between them shifted again, this time more subtly, as if the system had reached a point where large adjustments were no longer necessary. The data stabilized into something quieter, more refined. Teven became aware suddenly of how close they were standing. Not uncomfortably close, Not by any objective measure, but closer than they had been in the corridor. Close enough that the space between them felt defined. He cleared his throat softly. I assume, he said, that this is the part where it reaches a conclusion. Rael did not respond immediately. Her attention remained on the table, on the final alignment of data, on the quiet certainty of a system that had already decided what it was going to say. Yes, she said finally. The surface dimmed, then brightened once more, the patterns resolving into a single, clear sequence. Tevin read it, then read it again. He did not move. That, he said carefully, is not ambiguous. No, Rael replied. It is also, he added, not what I expected. No. He let out a slow breath. I am beginning to understand, he said, why your sister did not explain this in detail. Rael's gaze shifted just briefly toward him. Yes. Tevin looked back at the table. I would like to clarify, he said, that I still have not agreed to anything. The table remained silent. Rael's ear flicked slightly. It is waiting, she said. Tevin nodded. Yes, he said. I was afraid of that. The light held steady. The decision, it seemed, had been made. It was now their turn to decide if they intended to follow it. The light did not change immediately after the results settled. It remained steady, almost patient, as if the system understood that comprehension required time and was willing to wait for it. Tevin appreciated that. He required more than a moment. He did not move. Not because he had decided anything, but because moving would suggest that he had. This, he said at last, his voice carefully neutral, is a very confident machine. Yes, Rael replied. It should not be this confident. It has access to more variables than we do. That does not make it right, Tevin said. It makes it informed. Those are not the same thing. Rael did not disagree. The table remained illuminated between them, the final alignment still visible, clean and unmistakable. Tevin resisted the urge to ask it to reconsider. He suspected it would not appreciate the request. I would like to know, he said after a moment, what happens if we do nothing? Rael's gaze shifted slightly, not toward him, but toward the edges of the chamber, as if measuring something beyond the visible. The system will continue to observe, she said. It will adjust its projections. And if we continue to do nothing, it will become more certain. Tevin exhaled. I am not sure I enjoy being part of something that becomes more certain without my participation. You are participating, she said. Tevin blinked. I am standing still. You are present, Rael replied. That is sufficient. He considered that. That seems like a design flaw. It is not a flaw, she said. It is efficiency. Tevin nodded slowly. Yes, he said. That is worse. The table pulsed once, as if acknowledging the continuation of their interaction. A new layer of data unfolded, not as abrupt as before, but quieter, more detailed. The projections returned, but this time they were slower, less about outcomes and more about process. Tevin watched as the representation of himself paused before speaking. As Rael's projection adjusted, not immediately, but deliberately, the system was not just predicting decisions. It was studying hesitation. That, Tevin said softly, is unsettling. Yes, Rael said. I do not like that it understands pauses. It does not understand them, she said. It measures them. That is not better. Rael's ear angled slightly toward him, the faintest indication of something between agreement and observation. Tevin shifted his stance, folding his arms loosely, then unfolding them again when he realized the system might interpret that as resistance. He placed his hands behind his back instead, then paused. I am reconsidering all of my movements, he said. That is unnecessary. I suspect it is not. Rael did not respond to that. Instead, she stepped a fraction closer to the table, her attention narrowing on a sequence that had begun to separate itself from the others. Tevin followed her gaze. The data was no longer abstract. It was comparative. Two columns side by side, shifting in subtle contrast. One labeled as projected response, the other as observed. Tevin leaned slightly forward. It is tracking deviation, he said. Yes. between what it expects us to do and what we actually do. Yes, Tevin nodded once. That feels personal. It is not personal, Rael said. It is precise. That is also worse. The columns adjusted again, one value shifting just enough to draw attention. Tevin watched as the sequence recalibrated, the projection altering in response to something he had just done, or not done. He straightened. I would like to stop influencing it, he said. Rael glanced at him. You cannot. I was afraid of that. Another pause, different again, less tense, more aware. Tevin became conscious of the rhythm of the room, the steady pulse of the walls, the quiet persistence of the system between them. It was not forcing anything. It was simply continuing. I have a question, he said. Rael looked at him. If we choose not to follow this, he continued, gesturing lightly toward the table, what happens outside this room? Rael's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle tightening that suggested the question had weight. The consolidation will not occur as intended, she said, which means there will be adjustments. Tevin nodded slowly. That sounds like a very diplomatic way of saying consequences. Yes, he exhaled. I was hoping for a less structured outcome. There is not one. Tevin looked back at the table. Of course there isn't. The light dimmed slightly, then brightened again, as if the system had reached another internal threshold. The projections narrowed, focusing on a single scenario now. Not multiple possibilities. One. Tevin watched it unfold. It was simpler than the others. No external pressures, no shifting environments, just two figures, standing in a space not unlike this one, facing each other. No immediate action, no forced decision, just choice. He blinked. That is new, he said. Rael's gaze followed the projection. Yes. It is not predicting, Tevin said. It is waiting. Yes. Tevin tilted his head slightly. I did not realize it could do that. It adapts. Yes, he said. I am beginning to understand that everything here adapts except me. Rael looked at him then, directly, her gaze steady, her expression composed but no longer distant. You are adapting, she said. Tevin paused. He considered denying it. He did not. That, he said quietly, is concerning. Rael's ear flicked slightly, the faintest indication of something that might have been agreement. They stood there, the space between them no longer defined by uncertainty alone, but by something more deliberate. The system continued its quiet observation, but it no longer felt like the center of the room. Tevin glanced at her. I assume, he said, that this is the part where we are expected to say something meaningful. Rael held his gaze. Yes, she said. Tevin nodded once. I was hoping to delay that. So was I. There was a brief silence. Then unexpectedly, Tevin let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh. Well, he said, at least we are consistent. Rael's expression shifted, just slightly. Yes, she said. The projection remained steady. The room waited. And for the first time, it did not feel like it was waiting for the system. The room did not rush them, which was perhaps the most unsettling courtesy it could offer. The projection remained steady between them, two figures facing each other, doing nothing at all except existing in the same space without instruction. Tevin had the distinct impression that the system had reached the limits of its authority and was now observing something it could not calculate. He found that unexpectedly reassuring. I believe, he said slowly, that this is where we become inconvenient. Rael's gaze remained on the projection. Inconvenient, she repeated. Yes, Tevin said, for the system, for the Queen, possibly for several governments I am not currently aware of. Rael considered that. That would be consistent with the situation. Tevin nodded. I am glad we are maintaining consistency. It is the only stable element so far. The projection did not change. Tevin shifted slightly, not away, not closer, just enough to acknowledge that standing perfectly still was no longer useful. The room did not react. The table did not adjust. For the first time since they had entered, nothing recalibrated. He noticed that immediately. It stopped, he said. Yes, Rael replied. It is no longer measuring. No. Tevin looked at the table, then back at her. I did not realize that was an option. It was not, she said, until now. He let that settle. Then we have done something impressive, he said. Rael's ear angled slightly forward. Yes. Tevin exhaled, a quiet, thoughtful breath that carried less tension than the ones before it. I have spent, he said, a significant portion of my life ensuring that I was not the deciding factor in anything important. Rael turned her head slightly, her attention shifting fully to him now. That was your intention? Yes. And now? Tevin considered the question. He could feel the weight of it, not imposed, not external, but internal, a recognition of something that had shifted without announcement. He had not chosen to be here. He had not chosen any of this. But he was here, and he was, undeniably, part of it. Now, he said carefully, I appear to be the deciding factor in something extremely important. Rael watched him. That is a change. Yes. He glanced at the projection again, then back at her. I am still deciding how I feel about that. That is also a change. Tevin almost smiled. I am beginning to suspect that everything is a change. Rael's expression softened, not visibly, not in a way that would be recorded in any official account, but enough that the space between them felt different. Yes, she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they had not said yet, everything that had been measured, predicted, and now, unexpectedly, left unstructured. Tevin broke it. I would like to propose something, he said. Rael's gaze did not waver. Go on. Tevin gestured lightly toward the table. This system, he said, is very good at determining what is likely. Yes. It is less effective at determining what is chosen. Rael tilted her head slightly. That is correct. Tevin nodded. Then I suggest we make a choice it cannot predict. Rael considered him. And what choice is that? Tevin took a breath. We do not reject this, he said, and we do not accept it as it is presented. Rael's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened. Explain. We redefine it, Tevin said, on our terms. The words settled into the space between them, not heavy, not forced, but deliberate. Rael did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. You are suggesting, she said, that we take control of the outcome. Yes. That we alter the structure of the consolidation. Yes. That we, she paused just briefly, remove the element of obligation. Tevin nodded. Yes. Rael looked at the table, then at the projection, then back at him. That would be unusual. Tevin allowed himself a small, careful smile. I have been told that I am well suited to unusual situations. That is not what you were told. No, he admitted, but it is what I have chosen to understand. For a moment, nothing moved. Then slowly, Rael exhaled. Not tension, not hesitation, something closer to decision. Yes, she said. The word did not echo. It did not trigger the system. It simply existed. Tevin felt something settle. Not certainty, not resolution, something quieter, something chosen. The table responded, not with data, not with projections, with absence. The light dimmed, the patterns dissolving into a smooth, unbroken surface. The system did not attempt to correct them. It did not offer alternatives. It simply stopped. Tevin looked at it. I believe, he said, we have confused it. Rael's ear flicked slightly. Yes, that is encouraging. They stood there for a moment longer, the room no longer watching them in the same way. The pressure had lifted, not because the situation had simplified, but because it had shifted into something they controlled. Tevin turned slightly toward the corridor. I assume, he said, that your sister will have questions. Yes. Many questions. Yes. He nodded. I will require a moment to prepare. Rael glanced at him. You will not be prepared. That has been my experience. A faint shift at the corner of her mouth. Then we will proceed regardless. Tevin considered that, then inclined his head. Yes, he said. We will. They walked out of the chamber together, the corridor receiving them without adjustment, without observation, as if it had already accepted their presence. The hall beyond was still vast, still luminous, still filled with the quiet weight of power and expectation. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. As they stepped back into the space where decisions shape systems, Tiven found that he no longer felt the need to disappear within it. He stood beside Rael, not unnoticed, not invisible, but present in a way that was deliberate. Across the hall, Queen Sara watched them, not surprised, not concerned, interested. Tiven met her gaze just briefly, then looked away. He did not rush. He did not retreat. He simply walked forward, and this time, he understood exactly why.